Mark.
Thank you so much for having me. And you know, what's really great, I already know a whole bunch of people. So hi to all those I know. And of course, hi to everyone. Thank you for having me.
Well, you're welcome. I'd like to share a little bit with our audience about you for those that are meeting you for the very first time. Mark Hagland is an adult, transracial, and international adoptee. He was born in South Korea in 1960 and adopted as an infant by white parents of Norwegian and German descent, and grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He is a professional business journalist and lives in Chicago. Has participated in in-person and online forums around transracial adoption for over 20 years. He's spoken publicly about issues around transracial adoption in numerous settings, both in the US and in Europe, and is involved in co-moderating Facebook groups around transracial adoption, now in several languages. This spring, he published his book, Extraordinary Journey, The Lifelong Path of the Transracial Adoptee. Previously, he was a contributing author to several books published by teams of adult transracial adoptees: Outsiders Within, Parenting as Adoptees, The Unknown, Culture Club. So again, welcome, Mark. We're just glad to have you this evening and hear a little bit more about your story and your work in the adoption community.
Thank you so much, Marcie. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here.
So tell us about your journey.
Well, it's a long one. I turned 60 last fall, so it's a really long one. And I've been joking with people that in traditional Korean culture, which I learned about as an adult, when you turn 60, you're kind of allowed to act out in any way you want. So the filters are falling daily now. But basically, I have this incredibly strong sense of mission in participating in the transracial adoption world and the adoption world more broadly. You know, I was among the first wave of transracial international adoptees, and the first wave mostly came from South Korea after the war. I had wonderful parents. They had zero resources. And when I say zero, I mean zero. There was nothing. There were no books, articles, there was literally nothing. And they had tremendous emotional intelligence and figured some stuff out for themselves. But nonetheless, it was hard. And for me, a huge element in my life, which really shaped my life, was the experience of racism and racial marginalization. And I was in a very deep transracial adoptee fog. Of course, back then we didn't have any vocabulary, so no one even knew there was a fog. It was just there and it had no name. And it took me decades. I ended up with a number of impacts from growing up in the environment I did. First of all, I ended up with a really terrible physical self-image, and I've been healing from that my entire adult life. And part of, one big chunk of my mission is just to try to get white adopted parents to live in as much diversity with as much racial mirrors for their children of color as possible, because it was absolutely devastating for me. It also took me a very long time to figure things out and to place myself as a person of color in society, and then to encounter both birth culture and just people of color in general. So I've been on a lifelong journey, and one of my themes in my book is that it is a lifelong journey. A lot of people, and I'll speak specifically to adopted parents, you know, they want to have a child, and for whatever reason, their path leads them to transracial adoption, and they think they're adopting a child. Well, yes, they're adopting a child or an infant, but they are now on this lifelong journey. And so many parents are completely unprepared for that. They're unprepared on the pure adoption front, but they're also very unprepared on the transracial adoption front and on the front of being white transracially adopted parents. So I started to get involved in the transracial adoption world in 2000, and I actually was brought into it through friends who were Korean adoptees who had begun to hold what we called mini gatherings. And one side note is that in 1999, the Holt Agency gathered together 400 adult Korean adoptees. We call ourselves CADs, adult Korean adoptees in Washington, D.C. And they basically wanted to showcase adoptees, like, look at these bright, shiny faces, and they're all doing well. Well, what they didn't count on, what they didn't bargain on was once the adoptees started, were gathered together and they had the chance to discuss, they started to discuss everything, child abuse, sexual abuse, general mistreatment by parents, the experience of racism, not having identity, all these things. And then that led to a cascade of gatherings of Korean adoptees. So we Korean adoptees were among the first transracial adoptees to start gathering in groups. And soon after that, others with other identities followed us. And so I started getting involved in conferences and eventually Facebook groups, because in this world in 2021, who's not in a Facebook group, right? And ultimately, some really nice things have happened. I mean, I became somewhat fluent in Spanish because of being brought into a group, and now I'm actually moderating a group in Danish, although my Danish is still elementary. So as a language person, that's been a huge benefit. So my basic theme, my basic mission has remained more or less the same, and that is I want the littlest transracial adoptees, the young children, not to have the experiences that I did. And as I say, I'm often asked about my parents. I had wonderful parents, and I still had devastating experiences. So we often hear, as I'm sure you know, that in the adoption world, love is enough. Love is not enough. Love is essential and fundamental, but it's not enough. So that's kind of my main message, that it's a lifelong journey for the transracial adoptee, and it's a lifelong journey for the transracially adopted parent. And eventually I just decided it's time for me to kind of collect all the things I've been saying for 20 plus years into a book. And so I decided to self-publish. It is just an ebook. Yes, I know people want to touch paper, but I didn't have the resources to, it's expensive to publish a paper book. So you can just go to markhaglandbook.com and purchase my book. And people who have read it have said very gratifying things, that it's been helpful for them. And I do hope it also might help adoptees who are not transracial adoptees on their journeys too, because there are, when I talk about the adoptee fog, there are elements throughout the book that apply to all adoptees. But of course, there's a very strong emphasis on racial issues, because that I found that set of issues still remains widely misunderstood in 2021.
Congratulations on your book. It's no easy a task to write a book, whether it's in paper form or e-form. It's quite an accomplishment. So I'm looking forward to downloading that and reading that as well.
I'll take credit for having written it on weekends, because that's when I wrote it. I'm very busy with my work, so go ahead anyway. Sorry.
Okay, so when you first started, you said when you came out of the fog, how old were you? I don't know if I caught you.
Well, I mean, I didn't say, because I mean, it's a continuous process, but here's how I would put it. The moment that I met fellow transracial adoptees in September 2000 at a Korean adoptee mini gathering, my mind basically exploded in a good way. And I would say that within about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, I was starting to move pretty quickly out of the fog. But it's still a process. I mean, that was 20 years ago, and I'm still learning certain things. I think it's really important to be humble and to state, like, nobody knows everything. And all of us are on journeys. We're on collective journeys. We're on personal journeys. But to answer your question, I would say probably it took a few to several years to really, pull myself the rest of the way out of the fog. But it was an astonishing epiphany that literally that first evening. We were sitting, there were about 65 Korean adoptees, and it was astonishing. We were finishing each other's sentences. We literally had just met like minutes before, and we were talking about the constant experience, the where are you really from experience, the what are you, who are you experience, the extreme isolation growing up in total whiteness or near total whiteness. I mean, it's just kind of amazing to find your peer group. I was 40 years old. It was a month before my 40th birthday. And suddenly, attend a dinner and have 65 strangers share the same stories, right? I mean, it's mind blowing.
And so tell us a little bit now, how many languages do you speak? Pick up on that.
It's a little complicated. Well, English. I would say my three really solid languages are French, Spanish, and Italian. I have passive knowledge of Catalan and some German, and I'm working on Danish. So, I mean, if you include everything, but I'm just an advanced beginner in Danish, but if you include that, then it's 7. But that's only a start.
And tell me about your family. What, do you have siblings?
So and I want to protect my twins' privacy, so I'm very careful about that. I grew up with a twin brother. We were adopted together. My parents did not have any other children, so we had no other bio siblings. We had no other siblings who were bio to our parents. My mother had an extremely difficult health narrative. My parents were not infertile, but she ended up, because of really, really, really bad health experience, she had to have a total hysterectomy. So she was unable to have children, but they weren't infertile originally. And so they had heard about, so my father actually knew a Norwegian missionary from Norway who was in South Korea after the war and wrote them a letter saying, children are being adopted, and they needed a lot of help because they were just ordinary people, and this was the first wave. They ended up getting help from their congressman to conclude the adoption. And so we were adopted in 1960, in October 1960, right after birth, but we were extremely ill in the orphanage, and we didn't come over till June 1961, when we were about 8 months old. In those days, and this is like a lifetime ago, right? To come from East Asia to the United States was kind of a big deal. You had to go on 4 separate flights. So you had to fly from Seoul to Tokyo, change planes again in Anchorage, Alaska, again in Seattle, and then we flew into Midway, Chicago Midway. That was before O'Hare. And then our parents picked us up and drove us to Milwaukee, the last little bit leg. But we were so ill. We had a lot of illness, and they didn't think we would live. So they couldn't bring us over until we were 8 months. And so it was a typical situation where we had what was called a chaperone. So it was a random South Korean lady whose son was living in Chicago. So she got a free flight, and she just had to take care of these 2 8-month-old babies on these 4 flights. But we weren't on one of the mass flights where they had literally like 200, can you imagine 200 infants in little kind of cradle situations on a plane? I just can't imagine what that flight was like. But anyway.
And when you were adopted, were you given much of your story? I mean, do you have any?
We have virtually no information. And one of the things to share is that very few, I mean, some international adoptees have done birth search and have been successful, but it's almost in spite of the agencies. Most of the information in your file is going to be false. And the core reason for that is the agencies, want to spirit the child to the waiting arms of the adoptive parents. And so anything inconvenient or not great is just going to be erased. And a lot is made up. And I found that out for a fact from a number of people who are experts in that area. So I basically know almost nothing. Most likely, I mean, we were told that our birth mother died in childbirth, which is possible, but a Korean adoptee who was doing birth search for adoptees. She was from Belgium, but she was living in South Korea, and she was doing birth search for adoptees. Said 2/3 of what's in files is completely wrong or false or made up. So she said, I told her that the one thing that we were told was that our birth mother died in childbirth, and she said, well, that's probably most likely false. So basically, then I know nothing. But at the time that I was born, South Korea was devastated after the war. And there were literally hundreds of thousands of children in rags, trying to pick food out of garbage cans and living on the streets. There weren't that many true orphans in the sense of no living parents, but the whole country was devastatingly poor. If you look at newsreels from 1960, it's just amazing. Now you go to Seoul and it's like Asian New York, right? But at the time it had been flattened. So most likely my birth parents were very young and very poor.
And how was that experience, when you're growing up and you're having these issues and you reach the age where you're starting to network with other transracial adoptees? Tell us about that. I mean, how that changed your life. I mean, the fact that you just shared with us that you have no actual story,
Information. Yeah.
yeah, information at all. The importance of being with your tribe and how that
Yeah,
helped
exactly.
you.
Well, I mean, one of the first things I learned that first evening in September 2000 was that everyone was told that their parents were dead, unless they were, like much older adoptees who were like 10 years old, and they knew that wasn't the case. But it was amazing because what ended up happening to me, and I write very extensively about it in the book, is I did the classic thing, which I internalized racism into myself. And the way I describe it in the book, and it's really only slight hyperbole, in the near totally white environment that I grew up in, I say that basically being not white was a capital crime almost. And it was very intense. And so I internalized that racism towards myself. There was something wrong with me, but I couldn't fix it. I couldn't become white. And it was amazing to meet other transracial adoptees, and they had the exact same experience, right? So it's immediately healing to connect with other adoptees. And as I said, that night in September, it was, as I recall, it was almost exactly a month before my birthday, my 40th birthday. And to have other adoptees say, like, to sit with strangers, people you met 5 minutes ago, right? And you're passing the bread rolls, and to have strangers say what you experienced your entire life is just, it's really hard to describe how completely mind-blowing it is. So that was immediately healing. And I went to a number of Korean adoptee mini gatherings, and I hosted one here in Chicago where I live myself. And I needed to go through that period, which lasted a few years, where I was just like being validated and being validated and being validated. And that led to intense healing. And I immediately wanted to share that. So I was recruited to be on a panel at the conference, which focuses on Korean adoption. And so I ended up staying for 16 years straight, and doing, some years I was doing 5 panels. So I was giving back a fair amount. And it was intensely healing and normalizing. And I have such a great sense of mission about that. I want the littlest adoptees now to not feel bad about themselves on a basic level. I don't want that. Like, one of the things at that dinner table, in September 2000, we talked about how we hated how we looked. And I talk about this in the book, and I think a lot of people don't really understand. Every single person on earth will say, well, I don't like the shape of my nose, or I think my ears are too big, or whatever. But when it comes to racial identity, if you're a transracially adopted child growing up in near total or near total whiteness, the level, it almost becomes a dysphoria against yourself. And many adoptees I know say, I was growing up, I would happen to pass by a mirror and I'd be like, well, who is that? You know, it's so you end up, many adoptees have had the experience I did, which was really hating your appearance. And I'm actually still working on that now, and I'm 60. I'm much better. I mean, functionally, I'm fine. But it really scarred me very, very profoundly. And I talk about that in the groups because many adoptees are so scarred by it that and so traumatized, they don't even want to talk about it, even with other adoptees. So I found a way to talk about it. And when I talk about it with white adoptive parents, I immediately caution them. You know, I don't want pity, I don't want sorrow, any of that. I actually find it kind of yucky, right? You know, I'm sharing from my experience purely to educate. I want the parents to understand that if they're raising their child of color in total or near total whiteness, their child who is 4 years old can barely explain anything to them, but is experiencing damage. Typically, what will happen is the child will come home from school, right? So she's like a 4-year-old Black daughter, and she'll come home from school crying, and the parents will say, "What's wrong, honey?" And she'll say, "Well, the other child just said my skin is the color of poop." And then the child will say, "I want to be white like you." Well, let's raise children in environments where that doesn't happen, right? Where they have daily mirrors of their own race, both adults and children, and of all non-white races. That will prevent that child from ending up experiencing this almost dysphoria about their appearance. And what's weird for me is that I am very proud of being a person of color. I have no issues with that. And yet, it's taken me literally, I mean, it depends on how you count when I started actively healing, but certainly my entire adult life. I'm talking about 40 years healing from the experience of racial isolation that led to a terrible physical self-image. And that's pretty bad, right? Like 40 years is a really long time. I want the littlest adoptees not to experience that. I want them to love being Black, love being Latinx, love being Native, love being East Asian, love being South Asian, all of that. I don't want them to hate their own appearance or to feel alienated from their identity.
Yeah, and how do you think, Mark, what are some of your ideas as far as how we can disseminate that information in the community? How can we, I mean, have you thought about doing some children's books yourself?
I've thought about it in my spare time,
I mean, how
but
can the adoption community help you? How can we?
I think literally what we're doing tonight, right? The thing is that speaking again specifically as a transracial adoptee, because I know there's been amazing literature created by same race adoptees, but for transracial adoptees, it really has only been in the last 20 years that we have been creating a literature speaking in our own voices. Even 20 years ago, if there were anything that came up around transracial adoption in the media, they would go to white adoptive parents and adoption professionals. Just to give you one little story, in 2003, I participated in what ended up being just a one-time event. It was planned to extend longer, but it didn't. So it was called the International Adoptee Congress, and several adult transracial international adoptees brought about 60 of us together in DC. And at that time, one of the things that was in the news was Madonna adopting from Malawi, and there are all sorts of issues as to whether she was able to skirt some of the rules and do all these things. But the discussion that came up was, who did they put onto, the ABC Evening News and CNN? It was white adoptive parents and adoption professionals. They never even thought to ask adult transracial international adoptees what their perspectives were on it. And we all agreed that that needed to change. So one of the things that needs to happen is, and it has been happening, it has been developing, is a dialogue has to include adult transracial adoptees and those who aren't adults in the appropriate situation. But transracial adoptees have to be at the center of the discussion and not just kind of, knocking on the window from the outside. Um, and as we've created this literature, that has also really helped because people are like, oh, I want to hear from this adoptee who just wrote this book. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I'm just adding my voice to the other voices out there. And when people hear and read and see us, it opens windows in people's minds. Um, Really, even now on Facebook, the vast majority of groups around transracial adoption are completely controlled by white adoptive parents. They're usually parents with very young children, and we call them the rainbows and unicorns groups. And any reference to the idea that there might be any challenges for transracially adopted children, you get booted out of the group, right? And so we need to break through to parents, especially, but also to the larger society. I think that we adult transracial adoptees have a very unique voice right now. As you know, anyone who's not living in a cave, there's so much discussion of race, racism, systemic racism, white privilege, white fragility, all of these things. What's interesting for us as adult transracial adoptees is those of us who were raised in total or near total whiteness, we completely ingested whiteness into ourselves, and yet we were never allowed to be white. So we have a kind of a unique perspective that I think is valuable that we could share with people. Does that help? Uh-oh. Are
That
we
helps.
okay?
That
Great. You
thank
froze.
you.
So yeah.
Now, I was just wondering, since you'd obviously, since you've written a book, that you probably contemplated whether a children's book might be appropriate.
I'd love to do a children's book. I can't draw anything, so I need an artist. My art is stick figures, like literally. But no, I mean, there are some really good children's books now, and we need what we need in children's books, and it's happening. We need more of it. We need children's books that normalize being a child of color of every race and ethnicity, and also of every family type. So a child who is white, who has Black parents, a child who is Latinx, who has one Latinx parent and one non-Latinx parent. We need, children who have gay or trans parents, every combination. And what that relates also to another key theme. Parents always ask me about this. They say, well, so we adopted transracially, we have this child of color. What's more important, having mirrors and connections with people of their race who are not adopted, people who grew up in their birth culture, or fellow adoptees and adoptive parents and adoptive families? And I said, well, of course, both are important. Every transracially adopted child needs to see both. They need to see children of their race, also of all races of color, and they need to see and get to know children like themselves who are adopted transracially. Both things are important to normalize that experience. And too often, more often, the parents fall on the other side, where they have they have four other families who have adopted transracially, and the kids all play together, but they don't know anyone who was raised in families of color. Occasionally it's the opposite, but usually it's where they know other families created through transracial adoption. And so books have to reflect that too. Uh, what's great, I have to say, I'm very heartened. When you consider what children's books are like now and what they were like 50 years ago, it's just unbelievable. I mean, literally, we had Dick and Jane, right? And Dick and Jane were like super white, right? And anyway, we don't even need to go there. But I mean, that's what I grew up with. And I literally grew up as a child in grade school seeing zero mirrors of children of color. Zero. Everything was white. usually blonde white, you know, blonde, blue-eyed white, and very bland white too, if I just may say. So, you know, see Dick and Jane. Dick and Jane are super white. Dick and Jane have white parents. Dick and Jane have a white school. Dick and Jane even have a white dog, right? So we've made great progress, but I just think that white adults have no idea how normalizing it is for a child of color to have mirrors. It's like huge, you know. Um, if I may, I'm going to share one personal story. So this happened about 5 years ago now. So I was already 55, and many of you are familiar with Anthony Bourdain. We were, you know, so sorry that we lost him. Well, when he started his, you know, global tour series, his second visit was to Koreatown in Los Angeles, and he, you know, so in this series, Parts Unknown, he would go to a place and of course eat, and he would meet chefs and food people. So he met two chefs, and one of them, Roy Choi, became rather famous because he created Korean Mexican fusion, so kimchi tacos and all that, became very famous. Well, what was amazing for me is Roy Choi and I look a little bit similar. And here I was 55 years old, and it was the first time in my entire life that I saw an Asian man who looked like me on TV. You know, husky. He's not bald the way I am, but facial hair, and not, you know, not like a skinny tech nerd, which is what you mostly see East Asian men as, young skinny tech nerds who of course are in IT and wear khakis. And so I just kind of went wild. You know, I was telling everybody, oh my gosh, I look like Roy Choi. Roy Choi looks like me. Roy Choi was on TV. And my friends were really getting tired of me after a while, but that gives you a sense of how, like, the average white person in our society, I think almost cannot even understand that, right? Because you're normalized, you're validated every single day. The only two people who were Asian on TV when I was a child were Sulu in Star Trek, and the two white actors who played Charlie Chen, of course, who were white. But anyway, and had terrible fake Asian faces. But anyway, so George Takei was it, you know? And I mean, I'm glad I saw George Takei, but can you imagine as a white woman if in all media, news, cultural, and entertainment media, there was one white woman that you ever saw? It's hard to imagine, isn't it? So that was my world. And my world basically told me that I was wrong. Like the way I was completely wrong. So that has really fueled my mission because I want the youngest adoptees to not have that experience. That's really important to me.
Thank you. And I think there's several in the room this evening that can relate to what you just said. And please feel free to
Yes.
anyone ask a question or add a comment for Mark. You can go ahead and take questions anytime.
Yeah, I haven't been looking at the chat. So are there specific questions for me yet? Just nice comments. Oh, including my adorable friend, my goddess, Claudia Antello, complimenting my Spanish. Mil gracias, querida.
I will ask a question.
Yes, please. Hi.
Hi. It's more of a comment, but kind of a question too, is that even though I am white, I grew up in a neighborhood where my complexion was darker.
Yeah.
And with my adoptive family, they were completely different from me. Not as much in looks as in personality wise and different things. And so I also had this same experience of isolation. And I think probably, you know, I can't imagine what it would be like to be transracially adopted, but I think what you're saying is actually something that any adoptee needs to know, needs to hear and think about.
What I hear, Diane, from my friends who are same race white adoptees is if they looked different enough from their families, they did have some experience of that. And I certainly am deeply empathetic. If you looked different enough that your parents were questioned or you were questioned, that's an experience to know about. In my case, you know, here we had a tall, bald Norwegian American father, you know, plump German mother, and two crew cut headed tiny Korean boys. Like in 1962 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that was not a family. Like no one, usually what happened was people would say, they would point, somehow they never learned not to point. They would point at us and then say to our parents, whose children are those? And my mother would get upset because, of course, she, you know, first of all, it was like the thousandth time someone said this. And she would say, well, of course they're ours. But as I say, in early 1960s Milwaukee, we were not even seen as a family, like literally. And then on top of everything else, you know, in those days, most people married and had children very young. So if anyone thought we were related, they thought my parents were grandparents, you know, which is maybe slightly better. I don't know, but no, I'm empathetic. If you grew up not matching your family, that is an element. I think the harder part for us as transracial adoptees is we often feel we don't fit into any culture, you know. So we grew up in white culture, and then when we try to integrate into our birth culture, often we're rejected. I privately advise a lot of parents and some adoptees, and one parent who I advised for several years raised, you know, so white parents, they had two adopted Black children, and they were raised in it wasn't a super small town, it was, you know, a small city in the upper Midwest. And their daughter, when she became a young adult, moved into a large city with a large Black population, and it was excruciating for her for a couple of years. She just, everyone knew that she was raised by white people. And it took her a while to learn Black culture, actually. And it was just so devastating for her to be rejected by Black people. And she's doing much better now, but we shouldn't have to have that experience, right? Like to be rejected by people of our own birth race. It's very, very hard, you know. And then a lot of transracial adoptees just feel we don't really belong anywhere. I mean, I felt very rejected in South Korea when I visited 3 times as an adult. You know, this gets into the specificity of certain cultures, but, you know, sociologists talk about high bar or barrier cultures and low barrier cultures. So East Asian societies are very high barrier. You have to know the language absolutely flawlessly. You have to know the customs. You have to follow the language or speak the language, follow the customs to be even vaguely accepted. You know, for all the problems in American society, if you're an immigrant, you can be socially accepted relatively quickly in at least certain contexts. If you're a Korean adoptee visiting South Korea, it's like super intense. You get the why the hell don't you speak Korean thing, and then when you explain that you're an adoptee, and there's a whole story about the vocabulary around being adoptees, as soon as they find out that you're an adoptee, you get this horrible. I mean, I literally got this 20 times a day. You know, you explain because I had to explain I wasn't Japanese since I have facial hair. They all thought it's Japanese. So I would say, no, I'm an adoptee. And so I would get the horrible sigh. And then the long speech about, we are ashamed that we didn't raise you here in South Korea, and that you are like scattered leaves, and and it would be like, okay, I'm just trying to buy a bottle of Coke, right? Okay, like, I don't need the whole like this intense pity drama. It really was kind of exhausting, and it would be like, oh my gosh. And so for us, it can be really intense. But I completely appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from, excuse me, from Jane. She says, hello, Mark, can you share some resources for young 20-ish age Chinese adopters? Support groups, Facebook groups.
I'm not sure what the Facebook.
That was a typo. I'm sorry to interrupt, but hi, Mark. This is great. I'm really enjoying your presentation. I am an adoptee with red hair who was adopted by a very nice Polish family, but I also have a second cousin who was adopted from China, and she's really struggling, and her mother is kind of at her wit's end, and she was going to be on this call tonight, but she couldn't be. So I'm trying to help her get some resources for her daughter. She's in her 20s.
So she should read Nicole Chung's book, which I've only read excerpts of so far. She should read what you can do, literally, this is not so hard. Google Chinese adoptee narrative. There are now several books, but she should also read some of the narratives of Korean adoptees. The experiences are very similar. I don't know the Facebook groups names, so she could just, start exploring. There are a number of groups for Chinese adoptees on Facebook. I know it, and that are limited to adoptees. She can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was just, because like you were saying, some of them are for younger Chinese adoptees, and with more like with the parents.
Right. There are a bunch of adoptee only groups. She can also PM me on Facebook. I'm just Mark Hagland.
Thank you.
Yeah,
so much.
absolutely. Yeah. We have a great question from my friend Moses. Thank you. Moses Farrow is such a wonderful leader in our community. So he says, as we become more and more of a melting pot, what are your thoughts about those who are mixed race and expats adopted to other countries, predominantly white? That is a fabulous question. So let me see if I can answer it very briefly. So first of all, one of the things that's happening now in American society that's very, very important is as more biracial and multiracial children are born, that is helping everyone. Now, it doesn't automatically help everyone that there are people who are biracial and multiracial, but first of all, it creates more mirrors for more people. Many adoptees are biracial and multiracial. Secondly, as we move toward a more racially mixed society, some of the old binaries start to fall away, and that really helps a lot of us tremendously. In terms of now adopting to other countries, that's so interesting. There's this term called third culture kids, which doesn't primarily relate to adoptees, but adoptees can experience it. The term third culture kid relates to someone who, say, for example, is American and is being raised, let's say one parent is American and one parent is Swedish, but now they're being raised in Kenya or something like that. So you end up in these complex cultural environments. And some adoptees are being raised that way too. There are white parents adopting children from one culture, from one initial society or country, and raising them in another. And those people are going to have a lot to say when they're all grown up, because that's another kind of dislocation of identity. Hopefully they'll grow up in an environment where they have mirrors of themselves, because even if they're in a society that is majority of color, if it's a different race than their own, there will be some issues. So yeah, I think it'll be complex for some of them. A great comment from Kelly. I have many friends who were adopted from Korea as infants, and their experiences are similar to yours, Mark, even though they were adopted from Korea later in the mid to late 1970s. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I should also note that, you know, I meet many adoptees now who are young adoptees, like 20 years old, but if they were raised in mostly rural or small town environments, they probably still grew up in near total or total whiteness, you know, even in the 90s and or 2000s, and that's just really, that's very sad. And I just want the adoptive parents to figure this out. You know, ironically, I often say this in our Facebook groups, the parents who most need our Facebook groups are the ones who would never think to join them. So I don't know how to reach them, you know, but we reach the people we can. And thank you to Teresa for sharing. I meant to mention the title, Nicole Chung's book, All You Can Ever Know. And there are so many books out there. Like one thing that Jane, I would recommend you and your cousin can do, just literally start, like Google the term or the phrase transracial adoptee narrative, transracial adoptee memoir, transracial adoptee book, you know, transracial adoptee autobiography. You'll find a ton of, what's great is now there is a real literature. There are a couple dozen books now connected to this from our viewpoint. And I don't want to sound harsh in any way, but, you know, read the books written by the adoptees. There are a number of books written by white parents that are well-meaning. Some of them are okay. But, you know, like, why would you want to read a book by a transracially adopted parent who hadn't had the lived experience when you could literally read 20 books by adoptees? You know?
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah, it's I sometimes like to try to analogize forward toward gender. So, and I know many of the people who are in these forums are female. So imagine if you wanted to read about women's issues and you said, well, I'm going to read a book about women's issues by a man, right? Like it would be like, okay, you know, and that's kind of what it's like. It's as well-meaning and even as knowledgeable as any white adoptive parent is, they don't fully understand the lived experience of the transracial adoptee. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book. And I should also say, in my book, not only do I talk about a lot of different topics, but I also purposely interviewed 13 fellow transracial adoptees, all with different backgrounds. So I interviewed people from different countries, going to different countries, speaking different languages. I translated a couple of the interviews. You know, I interviewed people of different ages, genders, situations, like some who were in birth family reunion, some who weren't, you know, all sorts of different situations. So I really wanted to try to make sure that the reader who acquired my book was not just ingesting my experience or my analysis of my experience, but the experience of 13 others. So that was really important for me to do.
Okay, Mark, we do have a Zoom user that's asking a question. Do you speak Korean, or do you have plans to learn Korean to explore your origins?
So great question. So here's the answer, and I don't know how they'll feel about the answer, but I learned a little bit of Korean before my 3 trips back. I went to South Korea in 2002, 2006, and 2008. In 2006 and 2008, I was part of a motherland tour. So in 2006, the conference was in Seoul, and then we toured South Korea. And in 2008, we had the conference here in Chicago, and then we all flew over, a smaller group, and went to Korea. So I did learn basic phrases. But my experience, and I want to make sure that everyone understands that my experience was individual. Some Korean adoptees have had a far better experience, but the experience I had was a constant othering because, you know, I talked about high barrier cultures. So South Korea, all the East Asian cultures are very high barrier cultures. And what that means is if you look like them, if you came from the same place, you're expected to speak Korean flawlessly, like a native. You're expected to understand every cultural nuance as if you grew up there. And there is literally no allowance for anyone who doesn't have both the linguistic and cultural knowledge. So when I spoke Korean, I mean, there were times when people there were times where someone didn't speak anything else. So I, hobbled through my 7 phrases or whatever. And of course, the most important phrase in any language is "Where's the restroom?" And I mastered that quickly. But um, but I also had so many alienating experiences of the variety of what the hell is wrong with you. So I want to explain one nuance about language because it matters here. So there are 2 ways to describe yourself if you're a Korean adoptee. Either you can say, I'm an overseas Korean, which is Kyopo, or you can say, I'm Ibyangin. Now, Ibyangin, originally the word for adoptee was Ibyang-a, which is orphan child. Like that was all you could, if you were an adoptee, you had to tell people you were an orphan child. So what happened was the adoptees from the United States, Canada, and Europe who are living in South Korea, Korean adoptees said, we don't want to describe ourselves as orphan children. So they made everyone say Ibyang-in, which is orphan adult, which is very odd, right? So the term now that's being accepted more and more is I am an orphan adult. So what happens is then you say, hi, I am, like they ask you, what are you? Or what the hell are you? And you say, well, I'm an orphan adult. So then, of course, you get the pity drama, as I call it. So you say, well, what I got, because I have facial hair, is, are you Japanese? So I had been prepared with my few phrases to say, no, I am an orphan adult. And so then immediately you get oh, we are so terribly sorry. We let you fly away like scattered leaves, and we are ashamed that you don't. And it's like, so imagine going through that rigmarole 20 times a day. Now, some adoptees are so thrilled to go back to their birth country, that it doesn't bother them. That's great. And they had better experiences. But for me, it was pretty alienating. It's like here, like I grew up in the United States, constantly asked, what are you? And when I was a child, it was literally that. Now people are far more polite when they ask, what are you? So I go back to my birth country and I get the exact same thing. What are you? And then why the hell don't you speak Korean? So I learned, I can read the alphabet. I learned some basic vocabulary, but I don't really have much use for it if I'm not over there. And when I go into Korean restaurants, we have a number of great Korean restaurants in Chicago, and I try to use my little broken Korean with the restaurant owners, they literally laugh in my face. So, it's not the greatest experience. And I love learning languages, as you heard at the beginning. I love learning languages, but I also kind of don't like, being embarrassed all the time. It's not a great experience to go, So I have a few different favorite Korean restaurants run by Koreans. I mean, now they're Korean restaurants. It's, a hot cuisine. So they're Korean restaurants run by white people. But I have a few favorite Korean restaurants. And there's one in particular that I've gone to for years. And it's great food and people are nice. But so it's run by a husband and wife. And the husband is nicer. And, I use my few phrases. Hello, how are you? Thank you very much. Good night. And I can order, I can say bring me, which is really easy. But his wife, every time I've tried, just laughs in my face. So it's not a great motivator. It's like you try to speak. Whereas like if you went to South Korea as a white woman, they would be so thrilled. Like they would like give you their restaurant, right? Like if you just said hello and may I have and thank you. But if you're an adoptee from the country, you're a Martian, and so you don't get any of that consideration at all. You get the third degree, or as I say, you get the whole shame and pity drama conversation, which gets so tiresome. Like the 10th time that you have the exact same conversation with another stranger, it's just like, ugh, right? So yes, I have tried, and it's not that I won't ever go back to it, but I just I don't get much out of it. You know, I'm glad I can read the alphabet. You know, it's something.
Okay.
Oh,
Uh,
my
oh,
dear
go
friend
ahead.
Sue asked the
Sorry.
question. Yeah, my friend Sue Harris O'Connor, she's my other goddess. Sorry, Claudia, I have two. I'm admitting it. But anyway, um, she asked, what do you find is the most challenging part of your identity? Wow. Okay. Do we have 36 hours? I think put really basically, by the way, everyone needs to read Sue's book, Sue Harris O'Connor, The Harris Narratives. But I think a part of it for me is simply that I cannot walk through the world without at times being questioned. You know, it's like if you're a typical white person, or maybe even a typical black person on a certain level, not that you won't experience racism, but people will kind of know what you are, right? Like walking down the street. But for me, it's this constant narrative burden. One of our fellow transracial adoptees, Sumitra Dorner, who I interview in the book, she's an Indian adoptee, and I met her at that 2003 International Adoptee Congress gathering. And she came up with this wonderful term, the narrative burden. And so the narrative burden is the constant questioning. So when I was a child and with other children, because children are blunt, so I was just constantly asked, "What are you? Like, what are you?" You know, and I had to explain and all that. Now, because I move in educated professional circles, people are very polite. So instead of "What are you?" it's "Oh, you have such a fascinating background," which is "What are you?" in a polite way. So, um, so I think that's one of the challenges that our identity as transracial adoptees certainly is not understood even now by the larger public. Like most people, I mean, most people are very polite. Like if they do ask my identity, certainly educated people who are kind, I'll just briefly explain what it is and I'll be like, "Oh, that's so interesting." They don't even know what to ask after that, which is fine. So that's one of the challenges. I mean, all people of color face racism. I face 1,000th of the racism of my Black brothers and sisters. Uh, but I get the Asian thing, the weird, threatening yellow horde, faceless foreigner, perpetual foreigner thing. And, I mean, I was on this bus. This is a number of years ago. I have to admit that. This was about 20 years ago. So hopefully this wouldn't have happened. And I was going downtown. It was very crowded. The bus driver was trying to push everyone back, and I didn't want to be pushed back. So I stayed at the front. And he actually said, "Do you understand English?" And I was just completely, taken aback because, I walk through the world. I'm me. Obviously, English is my first language, all this. And so it reminded me once again that, you know, I am seen as a perpetual foreigner by many white people. That's why I live in the diverse, accepting neighborhood I do, because my level of experiences of that is very, very low where I live. And I just don't want to have to, it's like a lot of people don't understand, why do people of color live in POC neighborhoods? It's because they don't want to be harassed, right? They just want to walk through their day and not have a bad experience. And so that's very true for me. I needed to escape to diversity. And oh, hey, Jennifer Ghostin, hi. What part of Chicago are you in, and what Korean restaurants do you recommend? Well, I'll have to maybe send you a PM or so. There are a lot of Korean restaurants. One really funny thing, by the way, I have to say, there are a ton of great restaurants here in Chicago. And we have a large Korean community. It's probably about the fourth or fifth largest, after LA, New York, Atlanta is huge now, Seattle. So Korean cuisine was seen as bizarre and stinky for forever, right? And then suddenly about 15 years ago, it became the hot cuisine. And so now it's like really, really in. So it's weird to be connected to an in thing when I first discovered it as an adult, most people still thought it was bizarre and stinky. And so it's kind of, it's weird to suddenly be hot, right? Like after all these years. So anyway, there are many, you can kind of check it out on Yelp and all this, but there are tons of great Korean restaurants now. And I
Yeah,
enjoy it.
like, I'm gonna be there in September. That's my hometown, so I'm gonna be there.
Hi.
Yeah, hopefully right after the NAAP conference in Indianapolis.
Okay.
Oh yeah, are you on the north side?
Yeah, I'm on the north side. There's this wonderful Korean chicken restaurant a few blocks away from me called Crisp. You'd love it. Everyone loves Crisp. I go there every week just to get a tub of cabbage kimchi. They have great cabbage kimchi. So look up Crisp on North Broadway. But send me a PM and I'll send you a list of great Korean restaurants. There's one on North Northwestern Avenue called Samsugapsan, which I can send to you. But that one's like super authentic, but it's super popular. So you have to get there really early.
Thank you, Mark, and really great presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, my dear. Great to see you. You look more fabulous than ever. How does that happen?
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Okay,
Or-
Mark, there was
Yeah.
a question earlier that we missed. Do you
Oh,
mind if I
sorry.
ask that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me get it back up here. I just lost it in the chat room again. 1 second. Okay. Tina Brown, she says, you seem to have such a heart for the younger adoptee.
Yeah.
Fitting from your lived experiences with the hope for change with the adoption culture. What would you say to your young self now knowing what you know as a 60-year-old man? Good question, Tina.
Oh gosh. Okay, so I am going to rely on a complete truism. It gets better. I mean, I think I would say to myself, tiny self, go find the place where you can thrive. I try to be balanced because I try to not bash the place I grew up too much. I mean, there were so many good things about Milwaukee when I was growing up. At the time that I was growing up, where I was growing up on the far southeast side, we had a great public school system, really good public school system, great public libraries. And it was a safe place. But yet at the same time, growing up in your total whiteness was devastating. So it's, I think a lot of people have ambivalence toward where they grew up, right, for various reasons. In my case, it was a super safe place. The part of town where I grew up, there was virtually no violent crime of any kind. And we had good schools and libraries and parks, but yet it was still devastating, right? And I think that's the thing that so many white adoptive parents don't get, right? Like they adopt a child, they wanted a child, they love their child, and they think because they had a good experience or they're in a safe area with quote unquote good schools and all that their child will be fine. And their child isn't fine. And one of the things I say to white parents is, no matter what age your child of color is, they're experiencing racism right now. They won't be able to tell you about it usually. They like if someone had asked me when I was 6 years old, I couldn't have even articulated what was happening, and yet I was experiencing it. And that, again, that fuels my sense of mission. So I would say it gets better. And if you don't have parents who are getting more woke about all this, you'll have to flee. I mean, that sounds terrible, but I mean, you'll have to find a place you'll have to move to a place that supports you. I love where I live. I've been here for 40 years now, this month, in fact, and it's just perfect for me. And, you know, everyone's an individual, different people have different needs, but I can tell you that not a single adult transracial adoptee whom I know personally wants to live in total whiteness. They just don't. Some do because they're, you know, like they've established their family or their career or whatever, and so they're kind of stuck. But I don't know anyone who likes it. You know. And then,
Tina, thank you.
yeah,
Let's see.
we have a question from Marina. Is that okay?
I think Peter was before Marina. He
Oh,
had his-
yeah. Oh, sure. Where is that question?
Peter, you want to take yourself off mute?
Yeah.
Me, Peter.
Hi.
Hey, how you going?
How are you?
Mate, there's so much wisdom, so much stuff I've learnt from you today. I don't refer to myself as a transracial adoptee, but I think I should. I was brought up in a Anglo-Saxon family in Australia, and I'm a late discovery adoptee 4 years ago at age 59. My father was Italian. On my mother's side is Australian Aboriginality.
But you didn't know that?
I didn't know that. No, knew nothing. Yeah. Well, it goes back a long time. Back in when I was a teenager, I do have a memory which came back to me after 45 years of a science lab discovery of that my blood types didn't match my parents, and that was sort of explained by a birth certificate that had their names on it, and yeah, so that the science teacher must have been wrong. I buried that for 45 years and didn't remember it till a couple of months after my my discovery. My wife was talking to her sister about blood types, and it just triggered this memory. So yeah, I relate to a lot of things you're saying. And I'm currently trying to get confirmation of my Aboriginality, which I know I'm accepted that, you know, my family is Aboriginal and my ancestry, but to get confirmation here, you have to get acceptance also by the community that you're living in and the land that you're living on. So I live on different land here to where my ancestors come from. So I have to get acceptance by the local Aboriginal tribe or mob here to get that. So I understand that feeling of getting rejected, or feeling that you're going to get rejected from your own culture. I don't speak Italian, which, you know, is one of the things that I dearly wish I could, and I've had a try, but you get embarrassed by the way you pronounce things. And I've got contact with many cousins, and I went back to Italy and visited my father's grave, and I was widely accepted there, and I had a terrific experience there. Now I just want to say, yeah, so many things that you say I can relate to, even though it's different cultures.
Yeah. Well, I would hope that, can you socially meet biracial people? Like online, for example? There must be groups of biracial Australians, for example.
Yeah, I'm in some Facebook groups with Aboriginal people. One of them is called Misplaced Mob, which is gathering of misplaced persons. And we, apart from forced adoption here, there was also stolen generation of forcibly removed Aboriginal children, or particularly half-caste children, if I to use that term. Tended to, the police used to drive around, they'd see a child was a mixed race, and they'd take them from the parents, just pick them up off the street and put them in institutions.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that going on, a lot of feeling. In Australia, like, going back, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, Aboriginality was something you hid.
Yeah.
And my grandmother hid it, and but her older sibling didn't, and so I've got cousins who have identified, forever. But now it's more common not. When you say you're Aboriginal, people go, "Oh, aren't you so lucky that you can relate and draw onto the connection to the land for 50, 60,000 years." So I do feel privileged that I can, show a connection with the land for that
Well,
period of time.
I appreciate your comment. I send you support. And I do think that meeting fellow biracial and multiracial people will probably be extremely healing, because you'll meet people who had some similarity of experience as you. So, I want to wish you all the best. I think that's a difficult journey too, being a late discovery adoptee.
Oh yeah, roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
That's good.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, Mark. Next was Marina. Marina,
Yes.
could you take yourself off mute, please?
Is she there?
Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Good. And you were asking, did I connect with family of origin? So it's a little bit complicated, and a piece of it I keep private, but I have chosen not to search, and I'm comfortable with that. I absolutely support all adoptees who want to do search. For me, what I can say, publicly and openly, is that I don't have a strong desire. I don't feel the strong need. Many do, and I support them in that. I just never felt, I probably was born to very young, very poor parents at a time when South Korea was totally devastated. The culture doesn't really resonate with me strongly. I mean, there were things I enjoyed there, but I just don't feel compelled to try to find anyone over there, so does that make any sense?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And many,
Sorry if I asked something too personal.
no, it's not too
Just
personal
when
at
you
all.
said you went 3 times, I thought maybe there was some
Well,
other
yeah.
connection there.
Well, no, actually, what you asked is what almost everyone thinks, like people who aren't right into the adoption world. For those of us who are transracial and international adoptees, people assume that if we go back to visit our birth countries, that we're going to do birth search, but they're really very, very different questions. And some international adoptees do want to do birth search. And as I said, I completely support them.
What did you call it culturally, the difficulty level of kind of breaking into the culture?
High barrier cultures. High barrier cultures.
Yeah.
So if you could Google that and get some definitions, but there are cultures, believe it or not, for all the criticisms I have of US culture, American culture is a low barrier culture. You can come here as an immigrant and, only, speak just basic conversational English. And yes, there will be racism and xenophobia and all that, but you can be accepted culturally at a much lower level of integration into the culture. If you go to East Asia, it's like, like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like 13. If you don't, as a Korean adoptee, when I have gone back 3 times, it's the constant questioning. And I know adoptees who are living over there. There are some who tolerate it well, others who don't. One of my friends lived there for 4 years, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, I just quit after 4 years. I was like, get me out of here." Like every single day, to constantly be asked, "Who are you? What are you? Why don't you speak Korean? What's wrong with you?" It's very, very alienating after a while, and it can create a lot of internal conflict, because many international adoptees have this intense desire to be able to integrate in some way into their birth culture that they didn't experience, right? But the way I kind of explain it to people, like, how easy would it be for you to integrate in Korean culture, right? It'd be like really hard. Well, the same thing for me. It's just that I have the Korean face, but it would be it would be the same for me as for you. If you just decided one day, I am going to go to South Korea, right? Like I'm going to learn the language, I'm going to try to integrate in the culture. Imagine how hard that would be. It's a very high barrier culture. And part of being a high barrier culture is tremendous amounts of assumptions that you have to learn that people have about behaviors. Uh, all the East Asian cultures are extremely conformist. So if you don't think like them, even if you look like them, and even if you learn the language, that's another thing that's kind of funny. People think, well, if you learn the language of your birth country, then you'll be totally accepted. Well, no, not at all. Not if you don't have the mentality of the country. They'll still see you as totally foreign. They'll just be able to say it in your birth language to you instead of English or another language.
Is it very common or at all or culturally accepted there for birth families to look, to search? Or do they just
That's well, that's a
not?
great question. So there is so much shame associated with relinquishment and adoption
That's
in
what I
East
thought.
Asia. Yeah. And so usually what happened was the typical story, there are many, many, many stories. The typical story is a young woman who doesn't really understand how sex works. She gets pregnant and her parents say, you're getting rid of this child, because everything in Korean culture and East Asian culture is face. Everything is face. And so it's like the 1930s here. It's shameful to be, have a child and not be married. And the irony is it's almost never associated with like religion or ideology. It's face. It's, you are bringing shame on your family. So what typically happens is it's a young woman and she's forced by her family to give up the baby, because there's no social services either. So it's if you choose to keep your child, you're like living on the street, like literally. And there's no support for you ever doing search either, right? And what often happens is the mother then marries later on and has children and never tells her husband. I know numerous Korean adoptees in that situation. They found their birth mother, but they had to be a secret for the rest of their lives, which is kind of awful too, right? So they couldn't even be introduced to the mother's subsequent family, and the mother had to meet them, on the QT secretly. We had a situation. So when we were in South Korea in 2006, we had the Khan conference in Seoul, and our wonderful founder of Khan is a white adopted mom with two Korean children who are now adults in their 30s, and she helped set up all these reunions. She set up, in some cases it was a reunion with birth parents, in some cases it was a reunion with foster parents, and people went to their agencies and did, and looked at their files on those. So one of the people, of course I can't mention her name, so I'll just call her X. So X was able to benefit from that, and she ultimately met her birth mother, although at the time they were supposed to meet, the birth mother chickened out. But then she contacted the agency and said, I was so afraid, but let's meet. And she got to meet her the day before she left South Korea. But the birth mother has to, quote unquote, keep her a secret. So it was like really hard, right? Like she met someone who was a stranger to her. And I can share a couple details because I'm not revealing anything about this adoptee, right? So I'm just calling her X. So the thing that happened was she met the birth mother. The birth mother didn't speak any English and X didn't speak any Korean. So the birth mother, they met at the agency, and the birth mother just basically cried for like 2 hours. So then the my friend X flew home, and the birth mother started calling her, although she was calling her at 5 a.m, which really irritated my friend who's not a morning person. So the birth mother would call her every morning. She only knew her name. Obviously, I'm not going to say it. So she would just say X. And then she would just like wail for like 30 minutes. And my friend said, I really wasn't getting anything out of that. And so you can judge her or not, but for her, it wasn't this great experience. And of course, we all want to imagine that birth family reunion is this amazing thing and everyone is thrilled and they just like hold hands forever and ever, but it's not true. And language and culture.
Probably culturally, she was never
Yeah,
allowed to grieve.
she was
If
never
it's all
allowed to
kept in,
grieve. Yeah, and she still isn't. I mean, my friend
yeah,
is a secret, right?
disenfranchised grief, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have the linguistic barrier because her mother, her mother has not tried to learn English, and I don't know, I have no idea whether she would have any resources to do so. So she literally just kept calling and wailing, like literally wailing. And so
Oh, sad.
it's very sad, you know, and my friend could empathize, but she was like, how many phone calls do I need to go through where literally I pick up the phone, she says my name and wails for half an hour, right? So from my friend's standpoint, it was just like she could empathize up to a point, but it didn't really lead to anywhere. And my whole point about all of that is that people who aren't adoptees or in the adoption world imagine that birth family reunion is always, you know, all things bright and beautiful and, you know, leaping through fields of daisies on a summer afternoon. And so often it isn't. So often there's tragedy.
And whole lifetimes have gone by.
Yeah, yeah. And so often there's tragedy involved. And then when you add language and culture on top of it, that's like several more layers to the cake. And because everything in Korean culture is face and shame, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it can be. So one of the reasons, and there's some private elements I'd like to keep private, but one of the things that I do share with people is I have many friends, international adoptees who are friends, who have had birth family reunions. And it's never simple. Like it's even in the best situation, it's super complex. And probably about 3/4 have been problematic for the adoptees. And that's not to say that they regretted doing it. Like many times people just want to know, but there's almost always tragedy involved. Like I have not yet heard of a case that wasn't in some way tragic. And one thing I can talk about real briefly is, because it was totally public, one of the Korean adoptees I know, and he presented his film at Cannes, John Sandvidge. And so John did birth search, and he was like kind of like live filming it. And he found out in the middle of his birth search, he found out that he was the product of rape. And it was absolutely devastating for him. And he basically kind of crumpled a little bit, like when you see so I can share that because this is a public video that he's, you know, promoted himself. And so you never know what you're going to find. And we screened the movie, the film, the documentary, and he talked about it. And he talked with us about how totally devastating that was. So I think all adoptees know this, like you never know what you're going to find, and it can be very difficult. So. Sure.
Okay, we're running
Yeah.
running low on time, Mark.
Yeah.
Do we have we want to scoot a last minute question in before we close? It's that time.
And thank you to Moses for sharing, yes, multiple layers of trauma for us. I do want to just say one thing though, if I could, Marcie. I mean, I always want to try to frame this in a broad way and to not tragedize our collective narrative, because you know, I've had a lot of difficult experiences in my life, but I've had some great ones too. And I'm having a great life. And what I don't want people, and I talk about this in my book, I don't want people to ever see me as a victim. I want them to see me as someone who's experienced things. And that's it.
Oh, I appreciate that. And we so appreciate you coming on this evening, Mark. We enjoyed, you know, hearing your story, your journey, and we so value and appreciate the work that you're doing out there in the adoption community to make a difference. So thank you.
Well, that's so kind of you.
And everybody, I think Jennifer has posted it maybe twice in the chat room, the link to Mark's book, so you can check that out. Jen, if you want to do it one more time, that would be great.
Very kind of you. I do hope that it helps people. I hope that it helps all adoptees, transracial and same race. I hope it helps all adoptive parents all adoption professionals. I'd love for adoption professionals to read this. And I hope it helps the adoption community and even people who don't have a connection to transracial adoption. Part of my sense of mission is to just kind of spread a little bit of light in the world. So
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
thank you so much.
Okay, we've got some closing comments. Jen, you have some things for me to share. Yes,
Yep.
she does. There
Next
she is.
week.
Okay, next week we have Miss Diane Bay joining us. Diane is an adoptee and will be sharing her story of finding out that her birth mother was actress Karen Black. So we're going to hear Diane's story. So please come back next Friday night and learn more about Diane Bay. And I think we have. And just a reminder, the Adoptee Paths to Recovery with David Bull is the 13th, July 13th at 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As well as one more. Dr. Joyce will be back with Support Reunion, the exploration Lost and Found, then what? Exploration of After Reunion. And she will be on at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, also on the 13th. So please sign up on Eventbrite for those two support groups. And if there's nothing else, I want to wish everybody a great week. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate all of you and hope to be back again next Friday.
Can I just say, Marcie and Jennifer, best wishes. You guys are doing amazing and wonderful work. Anything that I can do to support you, the organization, the community, just let me know.
We appreciate that. Thanks, Mark.